How are you, Uncle Tamba? Hi, Yusuf.
I'm all right. Surviving.
Hi, Renuka.
Where's Renuka
Oh,
now?
you're muted. Are we all good? Where's Uncle Jerry? Where's
No, it's coming
Ela?
on. It's coming on. Ela is on already.
Elf
can hear-
and Jerry that's left, yeah.
You can hear me, Yashica?
And Elf.
Yashica,
Where's Elf?
I'm here. Hi.
Oh, hi, Auntie Ela. I can't see you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're now live on Facebook. So I'm looking forward to your smiles and making sure that we'll get this program up and running soon. There's a few people that have not joined. Well, that's Prof. Kuvadia, but I'm going to try and help them as soon as we've started the program. So people are listening in live at the moment. So to all the viewers, welcome everybody. And it's nice having you on this very new platform. It's something that we're going to be doing a lot more often as we move ahead. I would suspect for 2 years now we'll be getting these types of programs done. But before I do the formal greetings and so on, we'll soon try and get everybody on board. I see all the participants are on board. There's just a few, which I will help very soon to get loaded on and we can get going. So yeah, it's looking good, and we're about to start at the exact time. So it's just about a minute to start, and I'll start promptly. The Heritage Center is very disciplined in terms of time, like the NIC former members and so on. So I will strictly make sure that I get to time and so on. And I'm very disciplined as far as that is concerned. So yeah, just about to start. Okay, we're promptly at 2 o'clock and we'll start our live Facebook program. Vanakkam, namaste, namaskaram, sanbonani nonke. My name is Selvin Naidu, and I'm your host for this afternoon. I speak on behalf of the 1860 Heritage Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to this online tribute to the memory of Comrade George Sewpershad. Before we continue with the program, I'd like to acknowledge our panelists, albeit online, for this inaugural live streaming event for the 1860 Heritage Center. Our program director for this event is struggle veteran and Tongat homeboy, Siva Naidu, who will introduce our panelists and guide you through the program. I trust you enjoy this tribute, and over to you, Siva.
Thank you, our host, the 1860 Heritage Foundation, and thank you to Selvin. It is indeed an honor to facilitate this panel discussion when we pay tribute to one of our icons, Comrade George Sewpershad. Now, to kick off, we're going to ask Nirod Brandel to share with us his experiences with George Sewpershad, to give us some introductory remarks, to talk a little bit about who or what the Heritage Center is. And but before he comes on, I thought it would be useful to introduce Nirod. Nirod is a former journalist, a social commentator, and a publisher. His family published the struggle newspaper, The Leader, for more than 60 years. He serves on the board of the 1860 Heritage Center and the Bat Center. But I thought before Nirod could come on, it might be useful for our viewers to have a dart into who is George Sewpershad. We have a number of viewers, and I thought it would be useful to give you a small profile of George Sewpershad. Nirod, are you comfortable with that? Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you, Siva.
George Sewpershad was born in Cater Manor, Durban, in KwaZulu-Natal on the 7th of October, 1936. He was an outstanding political leader, civil rights activist, and humanitarian. In 1956, George Sewpershad joined the Natal Indian Congress at the age of 20 and became an active member. After the crackdown on the liberation movement in the 1960s, he was one of the leaders of the revival of the Natal Indian Congress in 1971. He was involved in the founding of the United Democratic Front and campaigned vigorously against the apartheid injustices. He was part of a group that fought for the unbanning of the African National Congress and for the release of all political prisoners. Sewpershad was inspired by the Freedom Charter's promise that there shall be houses, security, and comfort for all, and supported the struggles of communities for civic rights. From the early resistance to the Group Areas Act to the later campaigns against high rents and rates, Sewpershad helped to mobilize communities from Chatsworth, Phoenix, Sydenham, Merebank, Wentworth, Newlands, Durban Central, Espingo, Bedlam, Tongaat, and Stanger. These efforts galvanized around the formation of an umbrella civic body, the Durban Housing Action Committee, in 1980, of which he was a founding patron. During this period, he was served with a second banning order. In 1980, the Bedlam Legal Circle honored him with an award for being the longest-serving lawyer in Bedlam. In 1983, the UDF in Natal elected him as vice president, serving under Mr. Archie Gumede as the president. Under Sewpershad's leadership, NIC activists worked very closely with sport, civic, and cultural organizations, promoting the values of unity and non-racialism. Civic struggles became more militant and opposition to the local apartheid state in areas such as Phoenix and Chatsworth. A major campaign was the rejection of the sham autonomy in Phoenix in 1979. Sewpershad was one of the team of lawyers who represented civic and other organizations at the Commission of Inquiry into the autonomy proposal, which was successfully opposed. In Chatsworth, the organizations campaigned against the City Council's intention to sell council-built homes to residents at market-related prices. In 1984, Sewpershad was charged with treason together with 15 leaders from all over the country. The detainees include, amongst others, the UDF president, Archie Gumede, Frank Chikane, Albertina Sisulu, Kasim Suluji, and Curtis Nkondo. In 2007, Sewpershad was posthumously awarded the Satyagraha Award by the Gandhi Development Trust for outstanding humanitarian services. The George Sewpershad Multimedia Center was opened at Frenance Manor Secondary in Phoenix by the then Deputy Minister of Communications, Roy Pudyati. The Reservoirs Pharmacy Healthcare Clinic was also named after him. Throughout the bannings, arrests, detentions, without trial and treason charges, Sewpershad maintained a quiet dignity and conducted himself in the most exemplary and disciplined manner. He did not seek the limelight, but was prepared to step forward during one of the most repressive periods in South Africa's history. Let's welcome Nirod Brando, representing the 1860 Heritage Center. Nirod, over to you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Siva. I appreciate those kind words. And to our fellow panelists, greetings, and to the viewers on Facebook. On behalf of the 1860 Heritage Center, I'd just like to welcome you all to this, our first ever inaugural online panel discussion. I think it's the changing times that have brought upon these necessities in order to exchange ideas and to celebrate a great life like George Sewpershad. And I join you now from Cape Town. Siva is in Johannesburg, and the majority of you are in Durban. So as Judge Thamba Pillay was saying earlier, it's just that he marvels at the at the modern technology that affords us these privileges today. But in saying that, I'd just like to give you a bit of background about the 1860 Heritage Center. It is founded on indentured history and the path and the journey that the Indian community in South Africa has taken in forging itself as an integral part of the South African social fabric. And in doing so, we enforce the social cohesion that should exist in South Africa today and is so necessary in contemporary society. So in celebrating our history, we do that alongside the broader democratic struggle and all its forces. As a journalist myself, in going back into the topic at hand, I worked occasionally with Comrade George Sewpershad, and I always found him an unassuming leader, which some of you may share with me later. I've had the privilege of being at the 100th anniversary of the NIC at the Gandhi Hall in Lawn Street. Some of you may have been there. And I shot a photograph of George in front of the statue of Gandhi that's in the foyer of the Gandhi Hall. And the caption was, "The first and last president of the NIC." And I always remember him as being unassuming. And as a photographer and writer at the time, I always wanted to put his jacket on properly. And in saying those few words, I'd like to hand over back to you, Savat, to take it through to the real experts on the subject at hand. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for making this a reality.
Thank you to Nido. Thank you to Selvin at the 1860 Heritage Center for giving us this opportunity to pay tribute to a stalwart of the Congress movement, Comrade George Sewpershad. Now, to do the honors, I have great pleasure in asking Comrade Thamba Pillay, who served on the executive of the Natal Indian Congress, to take the floor, so to speak, and to give us an historical background, to tell us about his association with Comrade George from his days in high school when both of them were at Sastry College, and then proceeding to the University of Natal, and thereafter graduating and setting up the first practice in Potchefstroom. Comrade Thamba, the Honorable Judge Thamba Pillay.
Thank you, Siva. Thank you to all the other people, and greetings to all the other people participating in this talk show. I think it's fair to say, and I think I'm quite accurate in this, that there's Swami there, and perhaps it's only Swami and I who have served under 3 presidents of the NIC. First it was Monty Naika, and then it was George Sewpershad on the revival, and then for a short while MJ Naidu as well. Now George and I have an association which goes back to something like 60 years. And I did a recent tribute to George Sewpershad when I pointed out that I met him in high school. And he was one of those guys who, let me put it this way, he was not one of the boys. He was always reserved, a bit shy. And I did point out at the time when I did that article that when he was young, he had this debilitating stammer, which somehow made him very reserved and so on. But then we went to university together, and there again, he did not take much part in student politics, but he did join the Natal Indian Congress, and he served, I think, in the Cater Manor branch. And like students of the time, we all were around selling the New Age and so on. But when I really got close to George politically was when he served articles with Rolly Arenstein. And I was at the time doing the Natal sabotage case. But before that, George and I went into partnership in Potchefstroom, and I described in my Facebook tribute to him what made us leave the the town and come back to Durban. When I got back to Durban, I got involved in the Natal sabotage case, which involved by Ibrahim, Sunny Singh, Billy Nair, Kearney Kinslow, and those people. So I was in and out of Rowley's office, and George used to work there. I must say, and I did pay this compliment to Rowley Arenstein, that he did a great deal to instill confidence in George Sewpershad, because when I first got to hear that he was going to do law, as I indicated, I was quite surprised, but because he had this terrible stammer. I also don't want to go over the incident at Port Shepstone, which made us leave the town, because it was obvious that if we had continued to practice in Port Shepstone, the clientele there would not have given us any of their business, because they knew that the local magistracy was very much opposed to us. So George went into practice in Verulam after he had completed his articles with Rowley. And then between just at the end of 1963, I was banned. And then George and I lost contact for some considerable time, because my banning order expired in 1973, or at the end of sometime in 1974. And when my banning order expired, George was banned. And then he was banned for 5 years, which meant there was no contact between us until at least 1978, when George got a further 3-year banning order. And it was only in the 1980s that we managed to start working together as NIC people. And then, of course, everybody knows that George's arrest in 1980, when I was arrested with him together with Rabi Bangwandin, Farooq Mir, MJ Naidu, Alf Karim was also one of them, and we served that time in Robben Island. But now, let me tell you something. Well, everybody knows about the Consulate 6, the detention at Motorby Prison, and so on. But let me tell you something about George. I don't know whether, I was wondering whether Jerry would be on, but I think Swami would bear me out. I wasn't there when I was banned when the NIC was revived. And I don't know the circumstances under which George was elected as the president. But I can tell you now that George would not have volunteered. He was the type of person, he wouldn't have volunteered to be president, or he would have put himself as a candidate against anybody else. George was that kind of very modest person. He never enjoyed the limelight. And in some ways, when I think back, and I think Swami will bear me out, there were similarities between George and Monty Naika. Now, Monty Naika was one of those persons who would have a viewpoint, but if he was outvoted by the majority, he would make that viewpoint his own. He was that kind of person. And George was also that kind of person. George was also one of those people who would never volunteer to go speak out at a public meeting. And similarly, Monty would rely on people like the real speakers of that time were people like J.N. Singh, Ismail Mir, M.D. Naidu, Dawood Sidat, and Hassan Mal, and so on. These were the people who really stole the thunder of most of the people who attended our meetings. And that would also include, of course, Fatima Mir. And that was George, always never seeking the limelight, quietly going about doing what he was required to do, and with his heart and soul in the movement. There was another aspect of George which I should share with you, and if Jerry was there, and probably also Swami would bear this out, and that George, and I also saw a bit of this in Subri's article about George being disillusioned when the new under the new dispensation, when the ANC took over. George was widely read. He was philosophical. He was in some ways a mystic. He liked, I'm not sure whether how religious he was, but he read Krishnamurti, he read Tagore, he was a disciple of Gandhi and so on. And I would imagine that his view that we, at some stage in our democracy, we would see the kind of trouble that we had under the Zuma administration. George would have said, I told you so, we have to be careful. Because I think he had learned from the lessons from the rest of Africa and from other countries who had freed themselves from colonial rule. The corruption, the get rich syndrome, the syndrome where people wanted to stay in power forever and ever. George always warned us that that could happen in South Africa as it has happened in the rest of Africa. So that was the kind of person George was. Modest of fault, but a deep thinker with an amazing foresight. And I think when we look back and consider the Zuma years, everybody who knew him at the time will say, you know what? George said so, be careful. Yeah, I think I've covered quite a bit about George. And I'll leave it to some of the others who would probably dispute what I had to say. But George was that kind of person. And I think, and I knew him for as long as about 60 years. So what I have to tell you about George is it comes from their heart and from personal knowledge.
No, I would imagine so. We thank you, Samba. You still have an opportunity to speak because we're going to give each of the panel members 5 minutes, and thereafter we're going to open this Zoom session to anyone who wants to speak to members of the panel. So let's move on. Our next speaker to take the floor is Renuka Subban. Now, Renuka served articles. She was a candidate attorney with Comrade George in Bedlam. And we want to ask Renuka to share her experience working with this luminary of the struggle. Over to you, Renuka.
Thank you, Siva. At the outset, I want to thank Siva and Selvan for setting up this platform for us to pay tribute to George, a legend during his time and thereafter. Greetings to the panelists as well as the Facebook users. My association with George commenced early in 1976 when I had my first meeting with him, but my articles were only registered in January 1977 after I finished my 2 outstanding courses for the LLB degree. I consider myself most fortunate and privileged to have served under his tutorship. On my first meeting with him, I realized that he was a very, very unique and non-conformist individual. There he was with his hair windblown, tie askew below the neck, and his sleeve cuffs open, hanging in the air. He had a lit cigarette between his fingers, and he barely smoked that when he put that out and immediately lit another cigarette. Little did I realize then that George and his office were to remain unchanged during the time that I worked with him, under him, and alongside him. Thus began my sojourn with a wonderful human being. I always wondered how he kept his clear thinking amidst the chaos that was his office. As a lawyer, he was meticulous, careful, and brilliant. Indeed, he was a legal luminary. He ran a fairly small practice. We did the general kind of work with the civil litigation in the lower courts and the high court, criminal work, administration of estates, conveyancing. But he grew a niche practice around the development of townships, small townships. And at that time, not many attorneys were doing this kind of work. And I noticed that George's clients were mostly the farmers along the north coast of KwaZulu-Natal. His clients trusted him implicitly. And it so happened that the families and the children of his clients became his clients. During this time, I also saw the caring humanitarian in George Sewpershad. Very few people know that every month there was a small check given to some of the families of those who were incarcerated at Robben Island. They weren't large sums of money, but in any event, they were small amounts that helped these families to tide them over their difficult times and to buy the necessities. Of course, to George, money had to be made, as in any practice, but it was not for any luxuries for himself. His needs were absolutely simple and very little. His car was just a mode of transport to take him where he needed to go, and it was definitely not a symbol of his financial success. Everything about him screamed of his simplicity, and paradoxically, there was nothing simple about him. He was quite a witty person, and he had a wicked sense of humor, and an intellectual and a strategic thinker. And this came to the fore during his time as the president of the Natal Indian Congress. Of course, the time that I was with him, from 1976 right up to 1982 in March, in that time, it was a very difficult period for George, with his banning and then him eventually being arrested and serving time at Modabi prison. Neither he nor I ever anticipated that that would happen. One morning, when I arrived at the office, I got a call from his brother to tell me that he was arrested and that the message was that I should continue with the practice. So I did not have any document from him, no power of attorney whatsoever to run his practice. It was a daunting experience for me, but I came out of that stronger and wiser. While he was at Modabi prison, he made an arrangement for me to visit for two reasons. It was very, very cold there, and I had to take warm clothes for him. And I also had to take the document which he had to sign, handing over a power of attorney to me to become a signatory on his banking accounts. I accomplished that. I was told by Paul David after that this visit became anecdotal, and he was teased about it, about this young lady coming to visit him at prison. Another aspect of George that really had a profound influence on me was his spirituality. And he sought refuge in religious books and the teachings of the great saints of India. Most of us know that George, in his quiet times, he had the Bhagavad Gita as his companion. And I'm absolutely sure that in his most difficult times, when he was banned, when he was also arrested, that his spirituality carried him through. And when, at the dawn of our democracy, his job as a human rights activist was done, he then chose to recede into the background, to continue to ply his trade as a lawyer until his illness that actually took him away. And I'm very, very sorry that he's not here. I really miss him. Thank you, Siva.
Thank you so much, Renuka, for sharing with us those experiences, indeed, in a very turbulent political period in our country's history from 1976 to 1982. And 1976 was indeed quite historic, you know, with the uprising in Soweto of June of that year. Thank you so much. And for information, Renuka continued to practice law and eventually retired in December of 2017 as a chief magistrate. And we thank you, Renuka, for sharing your experiences with us. Let's move on. Thank you. Let's move on. Let's get one of our doyens of the struggle, Comrade Ila, who is a social worker and a former executive member of the Natal Indian Congress and a founding member of the Natal Organization of Women, and also a founding member of the Gandhi Luthuli Trust. Ila first met George in 1958, and they were subsequently been classmates at the University of Natal. Ila's had a long association, like Tamba, almost 60 years with Comrade George. Over to you, Ila. So Ila is going to talk to us. Is she around?
Yeah, thank you so much, Siva. And thanks, Sylvan and Nirod and everyone for putting this together, because I think George really deserves, this kind of tribute. I was, in the first year of university, and we were in Professor Colin Turpin. I think Tamba, you might remember Colin Turpin in his class, and Sue Bazzi. I don't know if people know Bazzi Maharaj, because after his student days, he sort of disappeared from the scene. So there was Bazzi and there was Ramesa, Paul Ramesa. And then there were many others in our class, but I remember these three in particular because all three of them were ahead of me. I was a first year student and they were like at the university, I think, before me. So I relied very much on them for support and help. And Sue was absolutely, very, very supportive. The one thing I remember about him was his brilliant assignments, but nobody could read them, not even the lecturer could read it. Usually we say doctors don't know how to write legibly, but here Sue's writing was just atrocious. You couldn't read what he wrote. And the lecturers used to have to call him to read out, the lines from the assignment. But they were absolutely brilliant assignments, and he would always top the class. But this was a problem. He was instrumental in introducing me to politics as well, because at university we had two groups. We had the Unity Movement group, and we had those people who were aligned to the NIC. And it was during that time that I began to really understand the nuances in the political understanding of the unity movement on the one hand and Congress, philosophy on the other hand. And it was the discussions with Sue and with Ramesa and Bazzi that I got to understand what are the real differences in the views of these two, organizations on campus. And going on from there, I think what everybody has said, Sue was absolutely, a humble soul. At university, in 1958, when I joined the university, I also, I just turned 18 in that year, and I got my learner's license to get a car driver's license. I think his brother used to run
Driving school.
yeah, what do you call them?
Driving school.
School, yeah. I think it was called Cosmos or something like that, yeah. And I joined that, and I didn't know that they were linked, that they were brothers. But later on, we got to know that they were brothers. And we used to, everyone at university used to refer to them as Ram and Lakshman, the two brothers. I don't know if the family knows about it, but on campus, certainly Bazzi,
Ira.
yes, and others who were with me in the class would refer to them as Ram and Lakshman. And so I got to know the two families one through my driving school and other through the association at the university. And then later, I went off to India in 1960. So after 2 years, at the university, I was in India, got married and came back. And then by that time, I think Siu had left university and had set up practice. So my next contact with him was when NIC was revived in 1971. And at that time, I remember that, people had to really persuade him to take on that position of, president of NIC. Because he kept asking, isn't there somebody else? And we would say, no, Sue, you are the right person and we want you there. And so, yeah, we were very happy eventually when he took on the responsibility. I think I'll stop there because everybody else has...
Thank you, Ila.
Yeah,
Thank you for tracing that historical background of your first meeting with George Sewpershad in 1958, taking us through those university years and with people like Paul Ramesser and others who, in a sense, shaped your political thinking and consciousness when you were just in the prime of your youth, 18 years old. Let's move on. Thank you, Ila.
And before we do that, Siva, can we acknowledge the presence
Yes,
of Comrade?
I'm just about to do that. I also want to acknowledge that our panel has increased in size a wee bit, and I want to take this opportunity of welcoming Professor Hussein Kuvadia, who's more affectionately known to us as Jerry. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you.
And also, we had the good fortune of having with us Comrade PG, as we affectionately know him, but the world knows him as a former Minister of Finance and the current Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordon. Hi, PG. Can we hear you?
You're looking very good, I must say, and it's good to see all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I thought you would call me Mr. SAA or something like that.
We're going
to put in the Jamnada.
We'll put you in full flight later in the program.
You learned my middle name from the EFF, so that's good as well.
Absolutely.
I'm Julia. Now let's go on. Let's move on. We're doing well for time. We almost halfway through the first 5-minute slots that we've given each of our speakers, and I want to thank them for the discipline of keeping to time. Now let's hear from one of the members of the Sewpershad family, Nikhil Sewpershad.
Thanks, Siva. Thanks.
The family man. Talk to us.
Yes, the family man. Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for presenting me with the opportunity to speak about George Sewpershad, or as I lovingly called him, Aj, as we knew him at home. I really appreciated the posts made by the 1860 Heritage page recently. All the memories of our Aj came flooding back. My family spent the next few days reminiscing about all the fond and sometimes funny memories we have of him. I realized then that the memories we have of him are not that of the struggle icon or the president of the NIC, but that of a down-to-earth, sweet, humble, loving, and somewhat quirky grandfather. He had a very unique dress sense, somewhat unorthodox, as it was mentioned previously. He had the formal shirt and the tie, but neither were ever where it was meant to be. Half of the front of the shirt was tucked, the other half not so much. He had the tie, but it was never fitted. It sat halfway down the shirt, which was also an unbuttoned shirt from the collar. When it was cold, he had a coat or that signature jersey. But in all the time that I knew Aj, I cannot remember a single occasion where he wore the coat on both arms. It was always hanging down, slung over one shoulder, but that was just him. He never concerned himself with those aspects, and we loved him for it. I always felt that he was just so incredibly smart that he could not concern himself with such trivial matters. It was unimportant for him. He would much rather commit his mind to much deeper thought. Aj visited us multiple times during the week, more so during cricket season. It was always a pleasure. He lived with us for many years and we missed having him around. Although he mostly kept to himself with his books, he always found time during his busy day to talk to us and spend time with my father. He was always so thoughtful. He would bring us cakes on every occasion, always either snowballs or the freshest of fresh cream donuts. He knew we loved. Although when they arrived smashed and crushed for some reason, even though the bakery was 5 minutes away. We've always had dogs and he would always stop to play with them outside. Aj was such an animal lover. After spending time with the dogs, he'd then head to the TV room. He'd call us to sit down while he sipped on his tea and watched his most beloved sports. As a small testament to his brilliance, there's a quick story I'd like to share. There was once a superhero movie that came out and with an iconic saying. Being his grandson, and knowing Aj had a passion for philosophy and reading, I thought I'd impress him. So I waited for the opportune moment and I proudly mentioned it to him. Aj, I nodded, with great power comes great responsibility. Aj nodded back and proclaimed that it indeed was a good one. He cleared his throat, he shook his head, and I was not prepared for what followed next. Off the top of his head, Aj took me on a journey of all the philosophical minds throughout history. He knew word for word, he recited them word for word, who said them, the year it was said, and what his interpretation of it was. And I just sat there in awe. I was 13. I could not believe how he held such a vast knowledge of information still astounds me to this day. He was a beach lover. He would always take my brother and I for ice cream and a walk on the beach, which was always wonderful. But here's the thing. Aj did not walk at regular speed of walking. Even in his later years, Aj was phenomenally fit. A casual walk for him was a marathon run for us. He was incredibly fast. So most of the time he would power walk 10 meters ahead with minimum effort, turn back, look at us enjoying our ice creams, trying to catch up with him, and smile with that beaming smile of his, and wait for us to catch up. Then he would do it all over again until we reached the end of the pier. Then he'd look out at the ocean, spend a few minutes taking in the view, contemplating his thoughts, I imagine. I could go on. Those are just a fraction of the fond moments we had with him. It makes us so happy to share them with you. We miss him every day. We are just grateful to have known such a brilliant example of a selfless human being. Thank you for listening to some of the memories we have of our George Sewpershad, our Aj.
Thank you, Nikhil, for sharing the family man that George was. We're going to move on and let's now give Altaf Karim an opportunity to speak. Now, Altaf Karim hails from my hometown, Tongat, where he started his youth activism, and then he went on to the University of Durban-Westville and became the president of the SRC in 1980 and 81. There he led the school boycott, the student boycott, and was subsequently detained with George Sewpershad and a number of other Congress leaders. Altaf was indeed in the forefront of a number of anti-apartheid campaigns in KwaZulu-Natal, and he played quite a major role as an activist. Altaf is going to share with us his experiences with George, the time when they were in prison, to share some anecdotal stuff with us, and to talk about how George shaped his own thinking and political consciousness in the prime of his youth.
People have changed.
Okay, can I go?
Go, Arthur.
Okay, cool. Thank you. It's so good to see everybody. Although this is a Zoom meeting, you still feel that closeness much more than seeing Pravin on TV all the time. But thank you for giving me this opportunity to say a few words. I want to periodize what I want to say to the period late 70s and early 80s. Tamba has covered very well what had happened before that and a little bit too after that. During the 1980s, as you know, there was a formidable student uprising in the country. And I think we were so very fortunate to have people of the caliber of George, Pravin Gordon, Jerry, Tamba, a whole range of people, Zach, who guided and enabled us to make our contribution to the struggle in a more serious way. I'm saying that because come about 78, 79, we always felt a little bit arrogant about ourselves, and that's the reality. We felt, who are these old guys in the NIC that's starting to tell us what to do? And we always thought, you know, and George was one of the vehicles. I mean, Pravin and Yunus played a very key role in developing us. But George was one of those vehicles that we began to understand the struggle from its historical roots decades before us. And the one thing that I remember about George, and the thing that I can reflect on, is every interaction with George provided some measure of surprise. There was no interaction with George that just seemed to be straightforward, you know. The first, you know, the one thing that stays in my mind is we always thought about, hey, these guys are all rich, all lawyers, doctors, or whatever. And the one day George was driving me from a meeting, because we both lived in Reservoir Hills, back home. And on the way in his old brown Cressida, somebody came and knocked us. And George got off, pulled his jacket, and I thought George was really going to take off with the poor guy. But he didn't. It was that guy's fault. George apologized to him and telling him, so sorry what had happened. When George jumped back in the car, I said, what happened? You know, it's that guy's fault. Why are you being so apologetic to him? He says, you know how bad that guy is feeling. So George was always that kind of person who had empathy, who always looked from the other person's perspective as well. Another thing that I recall very strongly about George was the way he stood with us. Indeed, all NIC leadership stood with us at that time. But there was an occasion. We had planned to bring, I think, about 30 schools onto UDW to have a major protest rally. The police were present. One bus managed to get through of students, but then a whole range of other buses came and a large number of students. The police were there, the riot squad, between the UDW students and the school students who were the learners who were coming in. And we were trying to get the cops to leave us and allow us to have the rally. Eventually, we felt that instead of a bloodbath, we should ask the students to go home. But we are battling with the cops. And there from behind, when we look, there come dear George. Right in the midst of all of this, George comes there, his coat hanging on one side and his body in some kind of skewed posture. And he convinces the cops to allow the students to leave and everything to be done peacefully. It's an example of someone who stood with students, not just talked, but stood with the student. That was very formidable at that time. There was a third incident which also surprised us, surprised me personally. And that was in relation to when I used to go to see him at his house. That dog of his used to always chase me. But when I went there, we used to always debate about something. My job was to give him some feedback about what was going on politically in the campaigns, but it was also to get his input and pass it on to the senior people. But, you know, we used to get engaged in a lot of discussions. The one discussion, he actually got a little bit upset because I was telling him that the root to all our problem lies in our understanding Marxism properly. He was saying you have no clue about science to be able to understand Marxism. And that was his view. And I challenged him on it. And he said, look, I'm not saying I'm against or pro-Marxism, just leave that for now. But you have no understanding of Marxism unless you understand science and materialism and within science and all of that. And he gave me this book to read. Through all the jumble of books on his floor, I He gave me the book, I took it, I read it, I didn't understand it. It was very complex. But it was years later when I was with Orbicom and we were doing a transaction with a company from the US, a big corporate, and they wanted to do a due diligence on our facilities. So they sent NASA scientists to do the due diligence. NASA loved it because at that time, MultiChoice was actually very cutting edge. They loved it, they had a good listening, and at supper, we began to talk. And I raised some issues with them. And one of the guys turns around and says, "You read the book?" And I said, "Which book?" It was the book that George had given me, Dancing Woolly Masters, although it sounds too mystical. But it was standard reading for the guys there. So George was a formidable thinker. I want to expand on that more because Damba's post covers on Facebook very well some of the other thinking that George was doing. But I think every interaction with George, I'm trying to make the point, was one of a little bit of surprise. In 1980, we spent a little bit of time with George in Motor-B, and I remember him standing in that one cell that was empty and always praying and reciting hymns and stuff like that. The important thing I really thought was this, that without George, Jerry, Pravin, Damba, all the other guys who contributed at that time, the boycott would have fizzled out without a substantive contribution to the struggle. Because of that involvement, what happened then could be made a massive change in terms of recruitment into the ANC, recruitment into the cadreship, and the threshold of people necessary to go towards change and revolution. Last comment. I think it's very important that we also, while celebrating and remembering George's life, remember the kind of lessons he passed on. Again, Tamba talked about him saying, at this stage, he would have told us, "I told you so." But I think the important part, while he would have done that, the important part is that George believed very much, over and above all the politics, that the well-being of people is the critical thing. Today, in a post-corona world that we're going to be entering soon enough, that's going to become a critical issue. Issues of poverty, a whole range of health and other issues. And hopefully, some of the things George inputted into the struggle can contribute to the thinking of what would happen in post-coronavirus. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was taking us down memory lane. Now we're going to move on, and our next speaker is going to be Swaminathan Gowden. We called him Swami more affectionately. And Swami was an executive member of the Natal Indian Congress, and he was a founding member of the Asheville Housing Action Committee. He also served on the board of the David Lando, and he spent over 30 years in the child and family welfare movement, a stalwart of the movement, an elder, and let's give Swami an opportunity to give us Swami an opportunity to speak to us about his interaction with George. Swami, are you with me?
Yeah, thank you, Siva. You know, so as it now, we have read quite a number of our comrades saying something good about George and his fellow comrades and so on. And I'm pretty sure you might not agree with me, but we have reached a stage, Siva, where we are battling for time. Now, I don't want to take your time. And what I want to say is that I have been a background boy all my life long in the struggle, you know, and I want to very quickly talk about one or two items before we retire from here. Now, you know, there were a number of groups who were getting together, you know, on a situation where nobody wanted to know that what they are doing. See? Now we had, in other words, lots of underground movements within our own comrades. Now, up till that stage, I didn't know George so well, because so far as I'm concerned, George was a student in high school and university, and he was working towards his becoming a career and so on. Now, up till that stage, I didn't know George so well. But in the meantime, I knew where they were living. They were living in Madagascar, Kitebana. George was a young man, and his parents, of course, were very, very, kind people. They won't argue or they won't even tell you why you had come here and so on. Now, I want to quote one instance among all those of us who are here. MP Danke, our MP Danke, the old MP Danke.
Yes.
Now, he was in charge of a particular group, and he arranged a meeting. Having asked George's parents and even George himself, and George was quite understanding. He said, "All right, you'll carry on." And MP called a number of our youngsters, our working class people, and to have a meeting to discuss a particular item. Now, Dr. Randry, late Randry now, he was late Randry. Dr. Randry was not far away from our place. He came to me, he called me, look, we're going to have a meeting at George's house and we want you to come. So I went along with Randry, and we went to a stage where, Sia Lara shop in Mabel. Now, behind Sia Lara shop, there was a board notifying that the road is being, built up and so on. I think it's, wind and rain, heavy rain and so on, So Randy's car got stuck there. The 4 wheels got stuck. We didn't know what to do. And we had to go to this meeting. And the instruction that was given to us is, that meeting will start at 8. Please remember, we don't want you to come here 5 to 8 or 10 minutes later. It is on the dot and very important meeting. So there were a few Hindustani people living around there. They came up there and asked, "What is wrong, Bhaiya?" So he told them, "There's a very serious, I'm a doctor, a patient is almost dying, and I'm rushing that I got some." Don't worry, they brought all the logs and all, they lifted the car up. So both of us went. We went, going through Standard Road, and the people thought we were really going to that house. And over there, we took a left turn, we went on the other side, we went to Pentagon. When we went to Pentagon, we were about 10 minutes late, 10 to 15 minutes late. So in the meantime, Dr. Randy has got all the illegal books in his book, because he was asked to bring. So we went up there, and who you think comes out? Dr. Henry knocks at the door, MP Daka comes out. He looks at us. Before we could explain what had happened, why we came 10 minutes late, he uses F's and B's and tells us, "We asked you all not to come 5 minutes early or 10 minutes late. You must be here on the dot." Now, Dr. Henry is trying to explain to him what had happened. I don't want any rubbish. So he took us in. So we had all the, things that we had to speak, the decisions that was taken. And so what had happened was, after the meeting was over, we wanted to, they asked us, we can leave home now, but don't go anywhere. It was about 2 in the morning. Don't go anywhere and go home straight. Now, among us, we had our friend Billy Dyer. Now, Billy Dyer tells MP, "Look, comrade, I want to see my fro before I go home." And that's what happened. So MP starts swearing him, and in any case, MP told Dr. Henry and Tommy, "You'll take him, leave him where he wants to go to, and you'll go away home." Now we left him at Warwick Avenue, and we shot off. The next morning, the paper says Billy Dyer was arrested. So I can tell many more things, but unfortunately, I think we are fighting for time. I'll stop at this stage.
Thank you for sharing, Swami. We're going to move on, and our next speaker is Jerry Kuvadia, and he's going to speak to us about George Sewpershad, the person that he knows, his relationship with George over the years, what lessons he learned from George as a young academic joining the Natal Indian Congress at that time, and what stands out about George's persona. And in your view, Jerry was there at the time when the Natal Indian Congress was revived in 1971. And perhaps you could share with us, how it became that George became the president of the powerful Natal Indian Congress.
Thank you very much. I always wanted to pay a tribute to George because of all the people I knew in the struggle. I had become very close to him, which is a bit surprising because he and I were so polar opposites in many ways. I had come from a very middle-class family. He had come from a working-class family, and so on and so forth. And we had many different views. But there were 4 things about George which attracted me to him as an individual, as a person, as a leader, and most importantly for me as a friend. So I nurtured that friendship, and he and I got on amazingly well for people from 2 opposite ends of the social spectrum. He used to visit me often, and my wife Zubi at our flat in Overport, and it was my pleasure and my privilege to have gotten to know him. So the things I admired most about George was, you all heard about his ridiculous attire and his coat hanging over one shoulder and his failure to pay attention to dressing. It didn't matter to him because it wasn't important in his life. The things that mattered to him, in my mind, there were 4 things. The first thing was the humility of the man. His humility was absolutely astounding. He had no personal ego which got into the way of work. And now when I've been working recently on this COVID problem, when the medical and scientific egos are on the parade, each one pretending to be greater than the next. I remember they asked Slim, I think, how come you guys are squabbling too much? They are having their own fights. And he said, his exact answer was, when you get the best brains in the country, they must disagree. I thought that took something extraordinary to say. George would never, he would have died if somebody said something so egregious. You don't speak like that. Certainly, they are not the best brains in the world. But that's the sort of thing George was about. He was absolutely commendable in his humility. And even when we discussed political views, you knew there were many of us were from the left. He was also from the left, but he was a much more modest left and had slightly different views. But that never got into the way of our struggle for freedom. I'm ashamed to say that I never suffered as much as George suffered. He was in jail, he suffered a lot. I wasn't exposed to that. And I always remember that he never held that sort of argument against me or any one of us. That's the first point. I loved his humility, utter, complete humility. And as I say, I sit now in the medical world with some reasonably clever, not extraordinarily clever, but clever people. But the egos are just unreal. You think that these guys are all getting ready to go to Stockholm to walk on to the Nobel Prize parade. George was the exact opposite. That's what I liked most, particularly in his political views. No matter how left-wing, now how radical, how communistic, or how socialist we are, that didn't get in the way of his love and attention to us and to my friendship with him. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is he was highly, or was highly intelligent. It didn't come across that way, because of his subdued personality, but he was an incredibly intelligent guy. And for example, I never understood why he was such a great admirer of all people in the world. Gandhi, you can understand. So he was an admirer of Gandhi, but he was also an admirer of Winston Churchill. I said, Sue, this guy was an archetypal colonialist. He harmed and nearly destroyed India, and yet you admire him so much. And he did, in fact. He admired him for many things, like you and I might admire him. He admired him for his mastery over the English language. He admired him for the way he led Britain out of the Second World War and so on. So he had reasons of great admiration for Winston Churchill, which was, once again, I found quite amazing. The third thing I want to point out is he had an unfailing integrity. I told you I'm working with these people now, and many of them are fairly ordinary guys and women who managed to do well at university and become doctors and succeeded to some extent or not. But the egos are just phenomenal. And no, George was never an individual to take pride in what he thought he had contributed. He was an outstandingly humble man. For me, that was his one characteristic which attracted me to him so much. He used to come to a flat in, where is it now? La Lucia, and eat with us, or Zubi and me, and discuss all sorts of things which interested him and me. The third point why I liked him, so it was humility, his intelligence. The third was integrity. What's the meaning of integrity? I would talk about people, oh, he's a person of great integrity. Well, you go and look at this medical prima donnas. There may be something, but integrity is not what they've got. That, in other words, integrity really means wholeness, being entire as a human being, which means all aspects of your character should tie together. And if you are religious, so be it, but it doesn't mean you can ignore honesty and other things. And George had complete, total, and utter integrity. There was no flaw in his character in any one aspect. So I really admired him a lot. The last one, the last value is courage. If you think about it, the world was really bleak for us when we asked George to stand as the NIC president. It was bloody dangerous. It was unattractive. You couldn't get people to take the job, but George took the job. He took the job out of sheer courage because he knew it's an unattractive job, it's dangerous, it requires people who are honest and true to themselves. So in terms of integrity, George is once again an outstanding individual, and that's why he and I got along so well. And I remember clearly when Swami had spoken just when we went to see the chaps in the British consulate. You remember they had occupied the consulate, and George, in his inimitable way, nearly ruined us because Swami and I parked outside in my car of the consulate door, and we encouraged the chaps who were inside, including George, to come in and jump in at the back of the car. People came out, but George came to the door and stood there, and he kept looking to the left and to the right, and I don't know what he was arguing with himself, but he didn't take the hint and jump into the car. And in the meantime, the policeman came, grabbed the key of the car, and ran off. So Swami and I never forgot that particular episode. I think he would have got us all killed if he had his way. The last point I wanted to make is that I learned from him as I learned from Pravin and the others, because I didn't grow up in that way. I went to St. Anthony's School, which is a pretty privileged school. I went to Sastry College. I went to university. But I must say that he came out with a thoroughly hardened, reliable, honest, and faithful character. For that, I admired him, and I'll never forget. I'm sure Pravin will remember, and a few others, that when he died, they asked me to speak at his funeral. And there were a whole lot of the old, not the old guys who knew Sew well, but many of the ANC people. And I told them, it's really odd, that ever since George left, none of you guys ever came and saw him. This is the first time I'm seeing you here. And it tells a story about your commitment to the struggle and your commitment to a man who, because he's not a prominent figure public-wise, but he's a great man, you didn't come and see him, you never troubled to help him whatsoever. Excuse me, I think I should have done that 1,000 times over, because many people looked at Sew superficially and didn't admire him and didn't respect him and didn't love him for, for the qualities, which underpin that character. So to me, he was an amazing human being. And I always grateful to fate or what it was that brought us together, because I had been in India before that, studying medicine. And when I came back, I joined the NIC because George was one of them, but Mewa and many others, Pravin also. And it was a learning course for me to join the political organization. I learned so much, and most of all, because lots of political actors are also great peacocks, I learned from George how to handle all that recognition with due attention to my own faults and flaws and put it into some sort of perspective. So the last part I want to say, I'm really glad and pleased and honored to be considered George's friend. I really was his friend. He was my friend. And I've never forgotten that. And I hope our movement can turn out more characters like that. And I hope my own profession can do its work, retaining the qualities of humility and integrity and not being carried away by their own brilliance. That's the main point I want to make. And I know that George made an impression in my life as he made on my wife's life. That's not equaled by many people. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, I guess for the first time in my life, about this wonderful man. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for that very warm tribute to a wonderful human being. And I think George shaped our thinking, our political consciousness, the values that we espouse, that he espoused, and which you so eloquently brought out in this session here. I think all of us feel an heart-to-heart connection with George in a very, very special way. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
But before we move on, I've not introduced this man, particularly for our younger viewers, and there are quite a number that is watching the Zoom session. For those younger viewers, Yashica Padilla served on the Natal Indian Congress since its arrival in 1971. He is an eminent, internationally recognized specialist pediatrician and immunologist, and is a founding member of the National Medical and Dental Association, NAMDA, and is also a founding member of the United Democratic Front and served on its executive. Jerry is also a patron of the Active Citizens Movement that was established about 4 years ago in Durban. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank
We
you.
now move on to a family representative, but also an activist. Yashica Padilla is the niece of Comrade George, and she joined the Natal Indian Congress while she was still a student. Yashica is a medical consultant and serves also as the vice chair and founding member and spokesperson for the Active Citizens Movement. Yashish?
I don't see her.
Okay, we'll take Yashi when she comes on a little later. Let's go on to.
Unmute. Ashi, you need to unmute. Yeah.
Audience?
Hi.
Oh,
Hi,
Hear me?
Ashley. We
yeah,
Hi,
would
Ashley.
she's speaking from China, I'm told. Is that right?
Okay,
No.
yes.
I'm here. I'm here.
Oh, somebody is listening to this whole thing from China. She didn't go to China.
Thank you so much, Siva. And I think on behalf of my family, I want to extend our thanks to the 1860 Heritage Center for allowing us to pay tribute to our uncle on his 13th year since his passing, on the anniversary of his passing. It is an occasion that is mixed with both joy and sadness for us. And thank you so much for all the many wonderful tributes you've all paid to him thus far. As family, we are all too familiar with his various attributes of kindness, compassion, care, respect, which many have mentioned already. He was a person of very high intellect, and he had a great knowledge of politics, religion, and the sciences as well. These are all attributes that can serve our world so well today. He took a firm stance on justice, equality, and freedom, and having experienced many bannings and detentions as a sacrifice towards freedom for all South Africans. Corruption and greed, as we know, was something he abhorred. But of course, in achieving so much, there was also a very gentle human being who surrounded himself with his books, classical music, a love for the outdoors, and the company of family and a few good friends. What he represented politically, he lived and he practiced too. So we are all too familiar with him stopping on the roads and giving complete strangers a lift. He also always often gave legal services at no cost to those who could not afford to pay for such services. And for those suffering misfortune, there was always a deep sense of concern and compassion and a need to help in whatever way possible. Simply put, he was a humanitarian, an outstanding humanitarian who walked the talk. So therefore, as our family message today, as we sit online during this pandemic, massive pandemic, the legacy of a man like George Sewpershad leaves us with so much that we can take from. Now more than ever, with the pandemic bringing the world we once knew to a halt, with inequality being exposed everywhere on the planet, this disease has also reminded us that as human beings, we are all equal. Equally susceptible to this killer virus. There's no discrimination here, as we've seen. But what we have witnessed here is that when crises and inequality affect the poor, it does so with severity. Thus, as a family, we believe we must all now work towards alleviating discrimination and inequality post-pandemic. It is imperative that we create a new world order where all human beings are treated equally with respect, compassion, kindness, and care, in a society where people matter far more than profit. That is what George Sewpershad symbolized. Uncle George, as we know, defended human rights and sacrificed much for an end to discrimination and for a country where all will be given equal rights. Many of you who would have seen the poster where there's this image of Uncle George carrying a placard saying, "Equal rights for all." Equality for all became his life's mission. George Sewpershad took an equal interest in all individuals, irrespective of status or material accomplishments. This is what we should all aspire towards, for that is what our uncle worked selflessly towards. Our message, as we reflect on his legacy and giant footsteps which he's left behind, is to commit ourselves once more to creating a country where humanity prevails above everything else. A country where our government serves its people first, where corruption and greed is treated with contempt by our leaders. A South Africa where every cent in our treasury must be used in the fight to eliminate poverty. If Uncle George was here today, he would have wept at the sight of millions of people in his beloved country queuing in lines for food and handouts. He would be pained to witness a country where xenophobia emerges as access to resources lead to desperation. So as we realign ourselves hereafter, we can only hope that poverty, humanity, issues like climate change are prioritized, for it is always the most vulnerable people and communities that suffer most as a result of poor leadership. Uncle George exemplified excellent leadership. This is what our uncle's vision was for South Africa. A country he gave much and sacrificed much for. A South Africa we can all still work together towards as active citizens to create and build a better future. So thank you very much again to Selvin, Nirod, and the team at 1860 Heritage Center for this initiative. We as a family have received many tributes in the last week. There were many messages on social media platforms which were most humbling for us to read. Thank you to all who wrote these messages honoring him, and we acknowledge each and every one of your messages and tributes. And thank you very much for keeping his memory alive. As family, we feel confident that our dear uncle's soul rests in a peaceful place today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yashica. Oh, that was a wonderful tribute to Uncle George. And undeniably, he was an outstanding humanitarian. We're going to move on, and we're going to ask our next speaker to come on. Our next speaker is going to essentially summarize and tell us what lessons we learned from George's rich life. How do we keep his legacy alive? What we need to do to ensure that we have an active citizenry. What we need to do to up the pace on activism. How do we regenerate the activism that Comrade George, in the prime of his life, was involved in and gave his whole life to equal rights? So our next speaker is Comrade Yashica Padilla. He's a professor and he served on the NIC executive for many years and played a leading role, together with Pravin Gordon and others, in the establishment of a number of community structures. And these included the Phoenix Working Committee in 1978, and he's also a founding member of the Durban Housing Action Committee, which was established in March 1980. He retired from the University of KwaZulu-Natal as a professor of law, and he currently serves as an active citizen and is a founding member of the Active Citizens Movement. Comrade Yusuf.
So thank you, Siva, and good afternoon and greetings to comrades and friends on this panel and many of you who are listening in on social media. It's a great honor to be involved in this tribute to Comrade George Sewpershad. I want to thank the 1860 Heritage Center for hosting this event. And it's just been wonderful to hear all the great recollections, what a treasure trove of memories that all of us have brought to this broadcast. Everyone has their stories about George Sewpershad, and I have one too. So mine starts in about the mid-1970s. I was just out of university, starting my first job as an article clerk in the law practice of Clive Vowder and Sunny Reddy in Verulam. I lived at the time in central Durban, so I had to do a daily commute from town, as it was known, to Verulam. Now, I could no way afford a car on my article clerk salary, So I depended on a combination of public transport and the generosity of colleagues to get back and forth from work. On the subject of public transport, of course, that's another story to tell, but I should just say that one of my escapades was being mugged while attempting to board a bus in Briardean during that sort of time. However, the people responsible for ferrying me, to and from work most often were the lawyers who mostly lived in Durban and commuted to Verulam daily. So there are likes of Clive Vauda, I.C. Mead, and Pravin Gordon, and of course, George Sewpershad. As you know, driving with Mr. George was a complete mission itself. Of all my commutes, this was probably the most harrowing of all times. And you must remember that this was way before we had the N2, and we still had to go through Ottawa over that single lane bridge. I don't know if it's still there. So this was the kind of situation we were in. And of course, as somebody who was in awe of George and always wanting to be very respectful, I couldn't lecture to him about, eyes on the road and hands on the wheel sort of thing. So I decided to be a little more tactful. And one day I said to him, George, you've had a long day in court and must be very tired. So how about if I drive back today? And his retort was quick and sharp. He looked at me and he said, of course, he took his eyes off the road, as he always did. And he said, do you think my driving is bad? And then came the volley, which was, I've never had an accident once. So, who can argue with that sort of data? Anyway, that was George. And comrades here today have spoken at length about George's phenomenal contribution to the struggle and his legacy of service. He was no doubt, as we have heard, a humble, principled, and compassionate man. And those words actually mean something when you talk about George. And these words are used quite often, but in George's case, that is certainly true. We all know he was no great orator, but his was an intellect of extraordinary insight and depth, as a number of people have observed, from Nikhil to George and others who talked today. He sought no high office, no glory or prestige of any sort, yet he rose in the hour of our need. During the most depressive times, when we required leadership to stand up to the apartheid regime, George, a reluctant leader, did so. He became our leader, and we embraced him as our leader. And I have yet to come across anybody who was not moved or inspired by his leadership. Now, George taught us many things that we've heard today, and I'm not going to repeat all of those things. But I think most importantly, George taught us about servant leadership. I know this is a cliche that is loosely bandied about today. George never used that term. I don't think it ever was part of his vocabulary. Yet he was the embodiment of a people's leader, of a servant leader. He regarded leadership as service and an honor. Unlike many of today's leaders who see leadership as an entitlement and the people as their servants. So unfortunately, this is the era we're living in of shallow, vain, and celebrity leadership. Of course, present company excluded. Now, as people have observed, George was widely read, he thought very deeply about issues and so on. He would have foreseen, and in fact did foresee, many of the problems we face in our society today, as Yashica has already mentioned. The widening inequality, the betrayal of the lofty ideals of the Freedom Charter. And George, being an avid student of history, was very concerned about the challenges faced in post-colonial societies, the way in which new political and economic elites sought to displace the older ones. And as a result of that, the betrayal of the aspirations of the people, the rampant corruption and greed and so on. George foresaw that and deeply thought about those issues and raised them with us and worried about them. So what would George have done today? Remember, he deliberately avoided seeking any position in government, but he would have certainly remained a critical citizen. And he would have wanted us to be critical and active citizens. Citizens who remain steadfast to those ideals that we shared, who are not afraid to question authority, who are not afraid to call out the conduct of our leaders, not merely fawning followers. He would certainly hold public officials to account and demand transparency in all their activities and functions. He would want our public representatives to be working to help our communities, not merely getting themselves in the news for all the wrong reasons. So in conclusion, today, in the midst of one of the greatest challenges to our health, our well-being, and our very lives, George would have demanded servant leadership, for leaders to be working for rather than bullying the people into submission. We owe it to George, to Comrade George, to become that kind of citizen and to step up to the plate. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you. That was a wonderful tribute to Comrade George. We now going to move on to our last and final speaker, and we're going to give him a little bit more time. And who's joined us. Let's welcome Pravin Gordon. And Pravin, as many know, is the current Minister of Public Enterprises and the former Minister of Finance, and a leading light in the Congress movement in Durban, was responsible for shaping the thinking of political consciousness of a generation of activists in the mid-70s, and played quite a key role in building organizations, organs of civil society, which were responsible for community mobilization and organization to end apartheid. PG, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for allowing a gatecrasher to come in at the last minute. I wasn't sure whether I was going to be available, but thank you very much for this privilege. And thanks to all the organizers, including the 1860 committee, for celebrating the life of a very important and not adequately celebrated George Sewpershad. I agree with everything that has been said about, now let me before I agree. Now, Nikhil, I don't know how old you were when we used to visit him at the bottom floor of the Reservoir Hills house. But inevitably, it was the late Yunus Muhammad and I who would be visiting him. And one of these lighties, as we might say, would bring us tea and biscuits inevitably. And the debate, as Jerry pointed out, was always about, now you fellows on the left, you think you know Marxism, as Alf was saying. And we would debate the fate of the working class, the middle class, how the middle class is the most important element in a society, and why it is a driver of change. And we would, as amateur Marxists, argue why the working class and the proletariat was going to be the real driver of change. And that carried on for I don't know how many years over that period. But it certainly took us down memory lane. The other place where tea and biscuits were shared with him was at the Blue Waters Hotel. So he had a select little table. Again, a couple of us younger chaps would meet him there, and the hotel staff knew exactly how to have a cling-wrapped plate of biscuits, assorted biscuits, nothing grand, Jerry, not the luxurious stuff that you see in Woolies today or something. It was the old assorted baker's assorted biscuits. And then we would continue our discussions. The younger guys trying to persuade him about becoming more left and more openly so, and him persuading us to become a little bit more sensible and realistic about what was possible at the time. So it is in that milieu that our politics was shaped as well. Through Swami says he was a backroom boy, but one thing you didn't mention about him is his lineage in the SACP over many, many years, and in the trade union movement as well. Ila and the late Mewa played a very important part in generating the dynamics that led to the creation of the Natal Indian Congress at the time. But quiet, almost egoless, humble, a person of integrity and courage, I agree with fully. And I'll demonstrate that in a moment. But also somebody who had a huge, but quiet political commitment. And as many, if not all of you have pointed out, without any ambition for himself. It was about what was right. It was about what was necessary. And I suppose, as Jerry pointed out, what you could persuade him about at a particular point in time. The one thing you all didn't mention is that he was also a stubborn character. He held on to his views. He wasn't easily persuadable on some things. And for 10 or 20 years, we tried. So whereas some of you know him about 60 years, I think Yusuf and my generation know him for about 50 years now. We are indeed getting old, eh? But when you run through the period 1971 to the 80s, it's a remarkable period. It's a period when the Congress flag was dead, or on the ground, so to speak. It was Rolly Arnstein and Ravi Bhagwandin, I think, who started the idea that the NIC is the only non-banned entity in the Congress alliance. Why don't you guys do something? In Mewa, we had an activist who had already launched a bread boycott when he was unbanned for a short while. I remember the office Ila in CNR House next to where I used to live very well as well. Ila's involvement in 1973 in the Durban dock workers strike is something to really remember as well, because that was the pioneering strike which led to what we now know as FOSATU and COSATU and the labor movement as well. But let's look at that period quickly, 71 onwards, where both the politics transformed, but George transformed as well. 1971, if I remember correctly, was the Bolton Hall meeting. It was at that meeting that the motivation for the launch of the NIC took place, and where Ravi Bhagwandin was the cheerleader of that process. But at the same time, 1968 to 72 was a very important period in which the Black consciousness movement came to the fore as well. And for many of us, the question was, are we BC or are we Freedom Charter people? And several of us would have joined the Freedom Charter ranks, but it's in that context that the Black consciousness colleagues actually put up a demonstration at Bolton Hall to say, join us, don't create a separate organization, if I remember correctly. And that's 50 years ago, almost exactly. Then the 1972 conference in Gandhi Library, am I right, Ila and Jerry? Yeah. You remember that. Tamba was still banned. I'm sure the rest, some of you were there. And that is where the Durban Central branch was represented by the Black consciousness colleagues, Ashwin Sikhamji, Steny Mudli, and who once again tried to argue that there's no need for the NIC to be formed. And that's probably where George was appointed, elected to the presidency, and Dilli Naidu became secretary, Ramesa became the treasurer. So you're really taking me down memory lane to remember that particular occasion. Oh, by the way, what has happened to Gandhi Library since? One would be intrigued to actually know. So at the same time, interesting dynamics started at the UDW campus. And Yusuf, Monty Mudli, who's I think late now, Krish Govender, were a crucial part of creating something for the next, 3 or 4 years, Yusuf, called Fasity. So if you want Yusuf to sing for you in conclusion at the end, he can certainly do that. What was that? Jesus Christ, what? Something. Anyway, the Rocky Horror Show, am I right? Or something like that. But they did a fantastic job of using culture as a politicization tool at the time, because it was very hard to do anything as an alternative. But 72, I think, was the time when the university campus moved from Salisbury Island to where it is today. And John Foster was invited to open the new campus. And we were on campus. We organized, well, the Bramdo family actually printed stickers for us. Foster, go home. So the print there was at the bottom, Leader Press. So we had spent the whole night cutting out Leader Press. And these were self-sticking labels. So you could just stick them on the glass doors of UDW overnight. And so everywhere there was these yellow stickers, but we had a counter meeting in Kaji Hall in Leopold Street. Jerry and company might remember. But that again, and 3 of the security branch guys came there a bit early to try to intimidate a whole lot of people, including George and other NIC executive members who supported us at the time as student activists of the day. But the key period was around 74 to about 77, 78, where George, though banned at the time, and the NIC executive, was merely carrying, if you like, the Congress flag and operating as a committee. But 77 began the process, 76, 77, of the Congress movement now transforming itself into a more activist mode. Community organizing, 1978, if I'm not too mistaken, was the first, apart from the autonomy campaign in Phoenix, was the first of the anti-LAC campaigns as well. Some of you might remember. 78, 79, that led to the 1981 anti-psych campaign, the 1984 anti-tricameral campaign. And for listeners who are a bit younger than us and who know little about the 1970s, these were a very important events that led to the tumultuous 80s. And then Alf's generation came along in 1980. And from about 1977, 78, UDW, as we then knew it, became the recruiting ground. Siva himself was, by the way, recruited in about 1977, if I'm not mistaken, when the late Vish Sewpershad became a member of the Child Welfare Society in Tongaat. And that led to some of these guys joining the ANC underground. Logi Naidu was the operator of the DLB at the time. DLB is a dead letter box, by the way. It was a way of communicating between internal units of the ANC and the ANC structures outside the country. So we've got to talk about you as well, you see, not only you talking about us and the lineage you come from as well. But this is the period during which the NIC leadership had to make some choices. Does it become activist? Does it become broad-based? Does it actually embrace the student activists that were beginning to emerge across the late 70s and early 80s? And this is where the courage and the mettle and the adaptability of George actually comes to the fore. Yusuf will remember the Phoenix School Action Committee. And there was a little tent put up for a meeting in the Stonebridge grounds. And we were all watching from about 100, 150 meters away. But that was the first open activity in Phoenix. And again, the NIC, led by George and its executive, backed what was happening in Phoenix. By 77, the Chatsworth Housing Action Committee had got off the ground. And there again, you will see pictures in various places of George speaking at those meetings. And Jerry and Thamba and the rest got used to the idea across the late 70s and early 80s of walking the streets of all of these areas, going house to house, mobilizing for one or other kind of rally. And I'm sure they all have fond memories, although some of us young guys pushed them a bit too hard. So I can make that confession now to them as well. But they provided powerful intellectual, strategic, and political leadership to those of us that were slightly younger during that particular period as well. So George did not hesitate at all as these transformations occurred within our politics. And those are important. They're not, they weren't easy transformations. They involved banning orders or terms on Robben Island or joining the ANC underground, or at least knowing that, hey, some of these characters that are sitting in my committee are actually underground guys as well. That was what Swami was talking about earlier on. And that didn't scare him. That didn't lead him to say that I'm going to disown these guys. In fact, quite the opposite. he would accommodate the younger people, and those that were clearly coming from a Communist Party background like Swami, or the new Marxists like Jerry, and the veterans like Ila and Thamba as well. So without, I mean, I can carry on talking because the memory is just coming back, but let me conclude by saying that certainly some of Yusuf's remarks are absolutely correct. They are powerful lessons for political leadership. And there's a big difference between a politician and a political activist, by the way. A politician just keeps seeking office and staying in office, and will commit whatever compromises are necessary in order to do so, and strike whatever alliances are necessary to do so as well. So many of us, and I'm sure others as well, would like to remain political activists, difficult as that might be in a particular context, but that's the lineage that we actually come from. The second aspect is just the humanitarian and human character of a George Sewpershad. All the tie, the coat, the shirt, the various idiosyncrasies that all of us have so fondly remembered are really part and parcel of the person we know as George. And I don't know, Renuka, whether you remember us visiting his office from time to time during that late 70s period as well.
Yes, I do.
The third element is sorry, you do?
I say I do, yeah. I recall, yeah.
Okay. The third element is sacrifice. We thought we only needed to sacrifice during the apartheid era in order to defeat apartheid. We've also got to sacrifice in this era, and as long as we are alive, by the way, because democracies are not built in a particular humanitarian or value-biased way just because we have the label democracy across the constitution or across the country. Jerry and others will remember debates that we had probably in the late 70s and then into the 80s. What happens when freedom comes? What will happen to the kind of middle class that we will have at the time? Where would our politics actually be? How will we be sure that the spirit and the values and the objectives embraced in the Freedom Charter will continue to survive into the democratic years themselves? And we said, well, it all depends on the balance of forces at the time. And today, pretty much so, it depends on the balance of forces. To the extent that progressives are organized, they will be able to influence the course of democracies and the content of democracies. And progressives haven't done too well, by the way, across the world. It's right-wing authoritarian fascists that are gaining ground at the moment, whether it's on the East or on the West at this stage. So the challenge that progressive people across the world have, and certainly in South Africa as well, is how do you keep the progressive agenda alive? How do we keep regenerating new activists and younger activists who will carry the flag of a George Sewpershad well into the future? And democracies are not created the day we arrive at freedom. Democracies are created over time, and it's hard work. And the post-COVID era, as some of you pointed out, is another opportunity for progressives to determine how they instill the values of democracy, but far more importantly, how they restructure economies, how they restructure societies, so that we can actually take another step towards eliminating inequality and the kind of chasm that we have between upper middle classes and the working class and the poor that you can see represented across the globe today, but certainly in our own society as well. And in George, you had a firmness of belief. So it needs that same firmness of belief now in those values that many of us grew up with, but transmitted to a new generation that will assure future generations of South Africans that the George Sewpershads of the world and many of the people that are, if not all, of the people that are on this Zoom call have sacrificed for and who wish to see South Africa move along a very different trajectory compared to where we find ourselves today. But restructuring a society, restructuring an economy, firstly, is not easy, but secondly, is an absolute imperative as we go forward. So once again, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. I think, Pravin, you have encapsulated the views, the feelings of not just the members of the panel, but all the freedom-loving people of this country in paying tribute to George this afternoon. We're going to move on now. We've just got about 12 minutes left, and we're going to just open the floor up for anyone who wants to ask a question to the panel. We'll give them that opportunity. Or amongst the panel members, if you want to raise an issue which you might have omitted in your 5-minute slot, you can feel free to do so. Jerry?
Yeah, I'd like to say a few words because I think it's of historical and of immediate political impact. And that is what we do about this epidemic of COVID virus. I can tell you I've worked my life with virus diseases. I got my PhD with a virus disease, but I've never come across ever something as deadly as the COVID virus. And I'm not exaggerating. So the reason I find it so difficult is we don't have answers to it. There's no drugs that you can use to fight it. There's no vaccine yet. And we don't know when it will come or if it will come. But it has a capacity to destroy our economies, destroy the integrity of our societies, and ultimately can keep us back by tens of years, if not hundreds of years. So we have to find a coherent way of working against this epidemic, but with forces which fight it. And my fear is that with a few exceptions, those forces may not have a similar vision as we have. So I'm asking all of you to please join that struggle if you can, because it's been consumed by people who, first of all, never took part in any struggles, as far as I know, and many others who are opportunistic in trying to climb the ladder of success on the back of this dreadful epidemic. So it'll help everyone if you do that.
Thank you, Jerry. You would like to respond to that, Yusuf, of what needs to be done around the pandemic from us ordinary citizens, those that are watching the Zoom session?
Okay, yes, briefly, a couple of things. I think that people are already being asked to do very important things that they need to do to keep themselves and their communities and families from being infected. So I think that's the first order of business, that everybody needs to sort of observe that. Secondly, I think we have to start thinking about, as Pravin indicated, addressing some of the structural problems that exist in the country, which will merely repeat what has happened in this pandemic and has happened before and so on. So unless we are able to effectively deal with the inequality, the joblessness and so on, we're going to continue to have people living in high density situations, the rates of infection moving very fast and not being able to respond to that. And then, of course, there are a lot of things that a number of people are working on. People in the science are working on things. People in law and in related areas are working on things. So one of the areas that I am involved in is in relation to the patent law reform, because as things stand, we are not able to access a lot of those treatments and vaccines that are probably coming on stream because of strong patent protections of something like 20 years on each one. So we need to actually change all of those sorts of things. And this week, a group of 80 or so academics sent out an appeal to the president to put this in place. And then finally, I just want to say that we all need to get working in different ways and so on. But I also think that a lot of our institutions have let us down and are not sort of working effectively. And in particular, I think Parliament should be working more earnestly. And I know that some things are happening, you know, in closed meetings and all that sort of thing. And that in fact, in-person meetings are probably not a good idea at this point. But there is a lot of work for Parliament to be doing, our publicly elected representatives, to be passing laws, emergency provisions, and so on, but also to holding the executive to account, because we daily are reading of instances where police and defense force and so on are behaving very abusive sort of ways. So we actually need all of those things to be properly overseen, and Parliament is our elected body to do that. Civil society does its little bit on the side, but I think really we need them to get back to working. And I'll just end by saying that, you know, Pravin thinks that I still have the voice that I had 40 or 50 years ago that I can sing, right? So unfortunately, I'm going to have to pass on that. But also I have to say that those lyrics are not suitable for a family audience, you know, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Yusuf. We are about to round up. We've got 7 more minutes, and I'm going to give others an opportunity to speak, not just the panel members from outside. They could ask a question, make a comment. Tamba, what you omitted? Okay, if there are no further comments or responses to the tributes that were paid, I want to take this opportunity of thanking the 1860 Heritage Center for being such hospitable hosts, in particular to Selman, who has very quietly, unobtrusively played such a gigantic role to equip some of us who are not technologically savvy to keep us up to speed. And we want to thank you for that, for the coordination, to Nirod Bramdo and to Selvan. But before we could say goodbye, I also want to say to all of us and to those that are watching that the history of the Natal Indian Congress is being written, and it's important to tell the story. And the story is being told from the time the Natal Indian Congress was revived in 1971 up until the unbanning of the political organizations, or up until 1994. And so it's an important, very ambitious project, and there are a number of contributors to writing of that history, and many of them are on this panel. And we want to make an appeal for artifacts or memorabilia, photographs, etc., that you might have to contact to contact me, or alternatively to reach the 1860 Heritage Foundation, and Selvan will kindly document that for on our behalf. Parting words, I'm going to give Nirod Bramdo from the 1860 Heritage Center to say the parting shot.
Thank you very much, everybody, for participating in this online forum. It's been very informative, and I think it's very important that we record the histories and the contributions of those lesser known individuals, given the broader dynamic that has overtaken the democratic movement. And in our small way at the 1860 Heritage Center, we tried to do that. We've just done the 125th anniversary exhibition of the NIC, where a lot of that history is documented, and we've handed that over to Jayanathan to include in your publication. We'd like to contribute more, and we'd like to get involved in more events of this nature. And I'd like to thank Selvan and Siva for putting this together. It's our first ever, as I said at the start, of our online meetings. And please, maybe we should reconvene on a more regular basis to record those contributions from many elements of society that contributed to democracy and the dawning of democracy. To bring it back to contemporary society, I'm involved at Stellenbosch University at the moment, and I'm going to send you all an invite to the corruption levels during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's being run by the Studies in Historical Trauma and Transformation, and particularly looking at how corruption has entered the pandemic, considering that a lot of us have discussed it now. I'll send that via email. But once again, on behalf of the center, the directors, and our president and chairman, thank you very much for attending, and Salvin for putting this together, your brainchild, and for all of you for your contributions and wise words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nirod, and I want to thank the panelists, Professor Jerry Kuvadia, Judge Tama Pillay, Yashica Padilla, Altaf Karim, Renuka Subban, Ila Gandhi, Professor Yusuf Bauda, Nirod Bramdo, Swaminathan Gowden, and last but not least, Pravin Gordon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Keep well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.